Dr. Tippett, you about ready?
Yeah, I just realized I opened some things and they're all in your screen.
Okay, great. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bill Schneider. I'm the Associate Vice President of Research and Performance Management at the System Office. We're really excited to have Dr. Rebecca Tippett. She's a Director of Carolina Demography at the North Carolina Population Center. And she's going to talk to us a little about really kind of the environmental scan that she worked with us last year on as we're working on our statewide strategic plan to really kind of look at our demographics, the shifting demographics, and how it's really impacted enrollment, and also looking at some opportunities that we have as far as enrollment across our state. So, Dr. Tippett, I will hand things off to you if you want to get started.
All right, well, thank you guys for having me. I'm just going to go through, as Bill said, some of the materials that we pulled together for kind of understanding about the landscape of current attainment, some of the trends in terms of enrollment, both at the community colleges and at other institutions of higher education, and what some of these implications are for the state's community colleges. Specifically, I'm going to go through kind of 5 key topics, and these include, first and foremost, a top-line look at enrollment trends, and then a focus in on attainment trends among the adult population that's the most likely target of interest. Then we're going to drill down on curriculum, not because it's the only program that we had data for, but because it was the program that we had the most robust data for. It aligned most clearly with some of the other elements that we were getting from UNC, and it is the largest source of your FTEs for funding purposes, so we wanted to focus on that specifically because it is definitely the data there are pretty interesting. Then we're going to turn and look at kind of summing this all up with what we know and what we've seen. What might we predict in the future? And kind of reviewing all of that, we'll highlight a couple things where there's both opportunities, but of course there's challenges, or sometimes there's challenges that bring opportunities. And we'll also try to walk through a couple of those as well. So the first thing that we're going to look at are enrollment trends, and just a quick piece of information on where these data are coming from. So the community college data was provided by the system office. I'll be presenting on 2001 data through 2015. That was the most recent year of data available when we did this project. And the UNC data for enrollment were provided by the UNC system office. So these are directly from these institutional systems. And for all other types of institutions in the state, that data was downloaded and accessed to iPads. And it's aligned with the data for UNC and the community colleges where appropriate. So one of the things that you see here is, so we're looking at 2001 to 2015, and the gray bars here are highlighting recessionary periods. And what overall we saw is that while enrollments peaked somewhat during the recession, all enrollment types across all programs, whether it's continuing education, curriculum, or basic skills, are down from the peak levels that we had seen recently. And this is, when we first started looking at this was kind of a curious question for us, because this is coming at a time when we're talking about a really large millennial generation that's aging into educational, kind of the age at which they go into post-secondary. You see a lot of information on the increasing need for post-secondary education to have a family supporting wage. And we're also hearing all this conversation and concern about rising college costs. So in that environment, it seems as if there should be an opportunity for community colleges to capture a rising share of students, but the data does not suggest that this is happening with the enrollments. So that was we can't fully unpack that or understand exactly what's going on there, but it's definitely something that we saw in the data and caught our eye. Because what we saw when we look at UNC is that, in contrast to the community college system, 2015 was the highest year of UNC enrollment since 2001. And again, we're looking just at fall numbers, and these are fall head counts for 18 to 64. So just keep in mind that these will look a little bit different than other numbers if you're looking at kind of the full students served during the year. And last, when we look at the nonprofit and for-profit private enrollments, we see that overall nonprofit enrollments are stable. They peaked a little bit in 2011 and then have held steady. For-profit private enrollments also peaked in 2011 and have declined slightly, but both of those are fairly stable, similar to UNC, in contrast to the market declines that we've seen in the community college enrollments. When we're looking at kind of who's enrolled in these programs, so we can think about this in kind of 3 key age groups. So we have this primary or traditional college-going age group, which are those young adults age 18 to 24. And then we have the kind of delayed entry, maybe post-military, 25 to 34-year-olds who are also a little bit more likely to be in school. And then we have really prime working age adults, age 35 to 64. And when we look at those populations, when we look at who is likely to be enrolled, and we're limiting this to the population with a high school diploma or some college, no post-secondary degree, and when we look at the share of those adults enrolled in a 2- or 4-year degree program in 2015, we see, as is kind of consistent with what we know,
I've lost audio.
Same here.
I think we're back. Rebecca, can you hear us?
somehow I got muted by somebody else.
That was probably me. Sorry.
Okay. So I'm going to back up just a little bit and start with basically what we're seeing is that among 18 to 24-year-olds, the highest share of kind of people enrolled in degree-seeking programs is among that traditional college-age population, almost half, 46%. Goes down to 13% among 25 to 34-year-olds, and then we see that among the 35 to 64, enrollment in degree programs is a very small portion of those adults, just 3%. In contrast, we see that when we look at non-degree program enrollment, so this is things like curriculum programs or nonprofit and for-profit private institutions that are offering, certificate or credential programs, enrollment in those programs is higher among the 25 to 34 and the 35 to 64-year-olds than it is among the 18 to 24-year-olds, which is kind of consistent with this idea that education is a continuous process and people will be continuously refreshing their skills and retooling as the labor market changes. So this is kind of the landscape of education. But what has been going on with the population that you are serving over this time? And so we're going to look now at educational attainment trends among North Carolina's adult population. And specifically, we're defining the target population for the purposes of this presentation and also the purposes of the environmental scan as those who are 18 to 64 without a college degree, but who have a high school diploma or a GED. So this really doesn't focus on the population that might be served by basic skills programs as explicitly as it focuses on the state's prime working age adults who could be served by curriculum or continuing education programs. What we've seen is that overall, when we think about that target population from an absolute size perspective, we've seen steady increases in the size of that population since 1990. Increase from 2.2 million to 3.2 million in 2015. That's a 1 million increase. Over the same time period, though, we saw that the number of people in the state, the number of adults who already have a post-secondary degree, increased even faster, went from 1 million to 2.3 million, so more than doubled over this time period and had a larger both absolute and relative increase, increasing 1.3 million, largely because we became a major destination for highly educated individuals moving here from other states and countries over this time period. Okay, I see somebody said they lost the visual. Are we good?
Mine's still up.
Okay. And so over that same time period, we're seeing that while that population with associate's degree or higher has increased quite rapidly, the share of the number of adults with less than a high school diploma declined very significantly, in large part because North Carolina's on-time high school graduation rates increased significantly over this time period. And we're seeing what's called generational replacement, where older workers, older individuals who were less likely maybe to have completed high school are aging out of this 18 to 64-year-old population. So we're seeing some turnover that's also influencing these overall attainment trends.
Did you get my message? That kid I tested today doesn't have any record of him post-testing. The kid I tested today.
So
I asked Sean if he post-tested him.
So what we've seen, however, is that because in spite of that 1 million numeric increase in the number of people who are technically in the target population, because we've seen such a significant increase in the post-secondary plus kind of already attained population, the relative share of this target population as a share of the total has actually held fairly constant and has declined slightly in recent years. So in spite of increasing numbers, it's going to be harder to maybe identify and target some of these people, particularly in more populous areas where the overall attainment rate is much higher, just because the pace of population growth has been growing faster than the growth rate of this target population that you predominantly serve. When we look at kind of where people who don't have a college degree live, consistent with broader trends and broader patterns of population, there's more people in more populated places. So we see the largest number of adults with no college degree in urban areas. Reflecting different attainment trends in Mecklenburg and Wake, Mecklenburg does have a larger number, 273,000 adults on average over 2011 to 15 were living there that were potentially in your target population, compared to 243,000 in Wake. So even though those counties are about the same size, you do see some differences in terms of the relative concentration of those individuals. But when we look at the percentage use of where people are, you see kind of an inverse of the map. So when we're talking about total numbers, they're going to be highest in the state's most populous urban counties. When you're talking about counties and communities where the largest share of adults without have no college degree and might be served by community colleges in your programs, you see that it's much more on the rural and perimeter counties in the state. And the highest share here are Onslow County at 70%, which is consistent with a lot of the military populations, tend to have a high school diploma but don't always have a associate's degree or higher, followed by Hyde at 66% and Anson at 65%. So that's a bit of a geographic look. When we look at how this plays out across race and ethnicity, we see really big differences across groups. That darker blue bar in the middle is really kind of the percentage of the adult population that is in that's really kind of a key target for curriculum and continuing education programs at the community colleges. And you see that the highest percentage there are for Black and American Indian adults. Almost about 60% of both of those groups are kind of in that target population. About half of white adults are, but just 43% of Hispanic adults are, followed by 33% of Asian adults. Now, both Hispanic and Asian populations are relatively new in the state. We did not have significant immigration until the 1990s. And you see that the distribution of educational attainment across those groups is really different, reflecting different factors. So a lot of the reason why the Hispanic population may not be in your target population as of yet is because among the first generation immigrant adults, they tend to have relatively lower educational attainment, which means that they're likely going to show up in your basic skills program about as likely as they are to be in the curriculum or Con Ed. Among the Asian population, there are a large number of Asian adults who do have relatively low educational attainment, predominantly in the refugee communities, but the vast majority of the Asian population has very high levels of attainment and already has an associate's degree or higher. Oh, it's important to note that that was among the total population, 18 to 64. When we look at the younger adults, the 18 to 24-year-olds, we see significantly less variation in the share that have a high school diploma but no college degree. And so I think that this is important to keep in mind as you're planning for the future, and that the demographic characteristics of the individuals that you may be serving now are poised to shift fairly significantly because we're starting to see second generation Hispanic and Asian individuals aging into the population, and the characteristics and educational background that they bring are going to set them up for a different trajectory than those of their parents potentially. I want to focus now specifically on curriculum enrollments. Again, this is partly because this has some of the richest, most comprehensive data that we examined, but also because it was identified as being the source of the greatest number of FTEs. So what we see is that if we go back and revisit that trend, that curriculum enrollments are down about 32,000 or almost 14% from the 2010 peak. So they're just above 200,000 in 2015. And they peaked in 2010 just after the recession officially ended. So some of this is consistent with a broader idea that as economic conditions improve, people are more likely to go to work and don't feel a need to go to kind of continue their education. And if you had a recession again, you'd likely see this line rebound. But what we're also seeing is that a declining share of the target population is enrolling in curriculum programs. So of the adults with a high school diploma or some college, no degree, so of adults without a degree, a high of 7.4% of those adults were enrolled in a curriculum program in 2010, and that had declined to 6.4% in 2015. So not only are enrollments down, this is a large part because you're capturing less of the potential target population in your programs. When we see kind of geographic patterns of enrollment, we do see that this being kind of consistent with where there are higher concentrations of individuals who are potentially in the target population, but it also overlaps a little bit with where community colleges may be of greater interest for those individuals and a legacy of agriculture and manufacturing. So you do see that there's a higher share of the target population enrolled in curriculum in many of the state's rural areas. So statewide, over this 5-year time period, an average of 7% of the target population were enrolled in curriculum programs. That was at a low of 4% in Watauga County, so that's most of the individuals there, if they're enrolled in a program, are attending Appalachian State, and a high of 10% in Lee County. When we look at the 2015 enrollments versus 2001, you see that overall we've seen a shift towards enrollments being increasingly dominated or increasingly leaning towards being among 18 to 24-year-olds. So some of this is again because we're having a large millennial generation age in here. But overall, right now, the majority of curriculum fall enrollments are ages 18 to 24, and we're seeing that ages 35 to 64 are a declining share of those enrollments, down to 20% of enrollments from 27% in 2001. But it's important to keep in mind that while young adults comprise 56% of curriculum program enrollments, they're much more likely to be enrolled in a post-secondary program or a degree-seeking program in general. So the curriculum enrollments are actually a smaller share of their overall enrollments than UNC enrollments are. So 35% of 18 to 24-year-olds who are enrolled in a degree-seeking program are in a community college curriculum program, but 45% are at UNC, and 20% are at a private institution, either a nonprofit or a for-profit. When we look at older adults, 25 to 34 and 35 to 64, when those individuals enroll in degree-seeking programs, they are overwhelmingly preferencing curriculum programs in the community colleges for their degrees. When we look at the sex distribution, you see that among your target population, almost just about half, 49% of adults without a degree were female in 2015. But your curriculum enrollments are heavily biased female, so about 60% of curriculum enrollments are female. Now, this is in part because continuing education enrollments are the converse. They're about 40% female and 60% male, which reflects likely some gendered occupational pursuits. So the fact that nursing and many healthcare professions may be more likely to be in a curriculum track is going to be reflected in the sex composition of those programs, while occupations that may be more likely to be continuing education tracks may be more likely to be male dominated. But that is just one piece of a broader pattern of women's rising educational attainment and steadily increasing and widening sex gaps in terms of likelihood of enrollment and pursuit of post-secondary degrees. So moving from geography and age and sex now to race and ethnicity, I think it's important to note that one of the biggest demographic stories in North Carolina is beyond growth. It's about this diversifying population that we're seeing. And this is very evident in the racial ethnic composition of the target population that you could be serving. In particular, you're seeing a very high rising Hispanic share. In 1990, less than 1% of potential people that might be served or well served by your programs was Hispanic. This had risen to 7% in 2015. And that declining white share of the population is partly due to overall diversification, but it's also driven by the increased likelihood of degree completion among white adults. And the fact that we have high enrollment rates among minority adults, but they are not necessarily as likely to persist through to completion, degree completion. So there are some opportunities for partway home students to actually complete a degree among the Black and Hispanic populations. Reflecting this increasing diversity, we're seeing significant increases in the share of Hispanic enrollments in curriculum programs. In 2001, just 2% of enrollments were Hispanic, compared to 9% in 2015. And in fact, you'll note that this outstrips their population share. In 2015, 9% of curriculum enrollments being Hispanic is higher than the 7% of the target population that is Hispanic. So this is kind of a whirlwind, big picture overview of what's going on with the demographics and attainment and enrollment trends. But what are the implications of these trends for North Carolina and in particular the community colleges? So before we get into the implications, I want to have a quick word about methodology. So first, we use county level population projections by age and sex. These were obtained from the State Office of Budget and Management. So these are produced by the state demographer, and they're the official population projections for the state. We then held educational attainment constant to current levels using the U.S. Census Bureau's 5-year American Community Survey. We also held kind of the community college system enrollment of the target population to current levels using the enrollment data that we've presented previously, as well as the 2015 5-year ACS. And last, because we did this by sex and age for every county, we implicitly accounted for county sex and age differences because we accounted for their existing educational attainment structure and the likelihood of enrollment at the community colleges. And the big picture overall is that while the total population is projected to grow by 14%, or 867,000 over this time period, the number of individuals who are 18 to 64 who are in that target population, meaning they have a high school diploma but no degree, is projected to grow more slowly, just 12%, an increase of 374,000. And the number of enrollments in the community college system statewide is projected to grow even more slowly, increasing by just 9% or 20,000 individuals. So statewide, we're projecting that for each year going through 2036, there will be kind of steady, small increases in enrollment. So that straight line represents a change from predicted in 2016 through 2036. Overall, a 9% increase statewide. But one of the reasons that we're going to see differences across the state is that the challenge here is that when we think about where high enrollment is currently occurring, those high enrollment rates are often occurring in the counties that are projected to have fewer 18 to 34-year-olds, those that are most likely to be enrolled in curriculum programs in 2036 than they do today. So even if overall population is growing, and even though overall interest might be staying the same, unless the landscape of how people prefer and kind of prioritize institutions shifts, you will see declines just because of the way people are living and moving in the state. So when we look at the state's prosperity zones, we see a wide dispersion in how projected enrollments are anticipated to unfold. So when we look at kind of the three prosperity zones that are home to the state's large, fast-growing metropolitan areas, those are just projected to continue to see their enrollments grow, and they're projected to outpace state growth. Even though these areas have relatively lower kind of enrollment as a share of the target population, the really rapid population growth in these areas should have a significant impact on curriculum enrollments. So the Southwest Prosperity Zone, which is home to Charlotte, North Central is home to the Triangle, and the Southeast is Wilmington, Brunswick, Onslow, that area, are all projected to grow faster than the state, with the Triangle and the Charlotte areas increasing by almost 20% over this time period. Seen significant declines in areas that have kind of this legacy of manufacturing or agricultural employment. In particular, we're predicting declines in the Northwest and the Northeast. In part, these places have already been fairly hard hit by population losses, particularly the Northeast, but the Sandhills region may also be experiencing declining enrollments as well. And across the 58 community colleges, we're predicting really a range of experiences. So those prosperity zone levels are really big picture looks, but we have actually 33 colleges that are predicted to see overall enrollment declines within their service area. Some of those are going to see slight declines of 0 to 5%, while others may see declines of greater than 10%. At the same time, when you look at the increases, 25 community colleges have service areas where overall enrollments are predicted to increase. And while 7 of them are projected to gain by up to 10%, the largest number with projected increases, 10 of the community colleges, are projected to increase by more than 20% over this time period. So this kind of putting it all together, there's a few key areas in which I think the system has clear both opportunities and challenges for planning for the future and moving forward. So to think really clearly, the size of the opportunity is that we have a large target population, and 78% of adults who do not have a college degree but have a high school diploma are not currently enrolled in a post-secondary program in the state. That is an equivalent of 2.5 million individuals who may be well served by community colleges but are not currently participating in a post-secondary program. The challenge here, of course, is going to be identifying and recruiting among these individuals, because the largest number of individuals who are not currently enrolled are in the 35 to 64-year-old population. Many of these individuals may be doing just fine and may not necessarily be interested in pursuing additional education, but there are adult learners who may benefit from curriculum or continuing education programs, but they may be harder to identify and target because they're in a much larger and more dispersed population. One of the big things that we've seen is rising diversity, and I want to call very explicit attention to this shift, particularly in the child population. Because when we look at the current adult population, you see that overall, we're seeing major growth from 55 to 64, kind of the oldest adults that are aging out of the labor force in the next 10 years. The 25 to 54-year-olds will stay in the labor force. And then the 18 to 24 and younger represent kind of who's entering, and then the 10 to 17 are who's aging in, and the under 10 is who's in the pipeline kind of for starting to be 10 to 20 years from now. And you see that among those individuals aging out, just 3% are Hispanic, 21% are Black, and 72% are white. And going down to the child population, we see this shift substantially. So just in the under 10, 51% of those children are white, 23%, a similar proportion, are Black. But the big shift here is 17% are Hispanic. We have a slightly higher share Asian, about 3% versus 2% in the adult population. And another big shift we see in the under 18, and particularly the under 10 group, is an increase in the share who identify as other race. And this is predominantly multiracial because as our population has become more diverse, we have more people identifying as multiple racial or ethnic origins. And the reason that I want to focus very explicitly on the size of the Hispanic population is that we're talking about 355,000 Hispanic children in North Carolina. And most of these individuals, 92%, were born in the United States. So we're talking about second generation Hispanic children who are aging up through the state's education system and are just beginning to enter into post-secondary and are really just beginning to show up in many of the programs that you guys may be running. And they're of particular relevance to the community colleges because half of North Carolina's Hispanic high school graduates state that they are interested or intend to enroll in a community college, which is 11 percentage points higher than all graduates. So 50% of Hispanic high school graduates want to enroll in a community college compared to 39% of all graduates. This is a really large emerging opportunity for the community colleges. The main challenge here is that many North Carolina children are currently living in households where they have limited exposure to post-secondary education, and this is particularly true for the state's Hispanic children. So statewide, 28% of all children, just over 1 in 4, live in a household where the highest parental attainment is a high school diploma or less. Among our state's Hispanic children, that's 63%. So almost 2 of every 3 Hispanic children lives in a household in which the highest level of attainment for the any adult or household head is a high school diploma or less. And even when we begin to include kind of children living in a household where an adult may have attended college but does not have a post-secondary degree, we see that almost 90% of Hispanic children live in a household where they would be very much first-generation college students, and over half of our state's Black and American Indian children also live in households like this. So this is obviously going to be a big challenge in terms of helping individuals understand how to navigate the process and entry into post-secondary. And for our state's Hispanic or Latino youth, it may be complicated by questions or concerns about citizenship and financial aid that have been brought up to me by other individuals when I've spoken with them. But I will say here that I don't know as much on the programmatic side as you likely do listening in. And speaking of that kind of gets at one of the bigger challenges, I think, for both the community colleges and post-secondary in general, and that is helping individuals navigate the transition from high school, because we're having more and more students graduating from high school on time in our state, but we're not seeing more immediate or on-time enrollments in post-secondary institutions when we look at the community colleges and UNC. And that's in spite of the fact that the largest share of high school seniors intend to enroll at community colleges. So when we look at spring intent, about just over a third are saying that they're interested in going to a community college. A little bit less than a third are saying they're interested in going to UNC. 16% are reporting intentions to go to some other post-secondary institution, either an in-state private or an out-of-state institution. And 16% say, you know, I'm going to go to work, I'm going to go to the military, I'm not enrolling in post-secondary. But there's a clear gap in between what people say they're planning on doing and then what actually appears to be happening in the following fall. So when we look at that intent, it's highest in the Northwest. And so this map highlights where people are really most likely to say that they're planning on going to a community college. And if we overlay where people actually show up, it doesn't always align as well here. I will say that we see in the Sandhills region, particularly Moore County and that area, really high immediate enrollments in community colleges, not as consistent across all of these counties. But when we look at kind of who says they want to show up and where people are actually going, we see that there's 16% of students who said, I'm not planning on enrolling anywhere, but there's 41% that we can't clearly identify using iPads or institutional enrollment data from the state. So that means that there's 25% of high school graduates, 1 in 4, who have intentions to go to post-secondary but aren't enrolled in the fall. And when we look at the private and out-of-state intentions and enrollments, they're pretty consistent. About 16% of people say they intend to go somewhere else. 16% actually appear to show up based on IPED's data. When we look at UNC, we see that the gap begins to emerge. So 31% said that they were interested in enrolling at UNC versus 24% who actually transitioned immediately. So that's a 7 percentage point difference between intentions and immediate enrollment. But when we look at the community colleges, we see a much larger gap. So 36% of graduates reported intentions to enroll, but just 19% are actually showing up in the fall, which is a gap of 17% or of 17 percentage points. 17% or almost 1 in 5 high school graduates don't immediately transition to community colleges as intended. Now, some of this is the fact that people, particularly many community college students, are likely to delay entry slightly and not immediately enroll. So when we look at individuals who transition to the community college system within 6 or to 16 months of graduation, we do see a much closer alignment between intentions and enrollment, but there's still 7 percentage point difference between 16-month enrollment and spring intentions. And so when we're talking about North Carolina's high school graduation, 7% of North Carolina's high school graduates is 7,000 students per year. So that's a pretty large opportunity, and that opportunity is larger across in certain areas. The other thing that we're seeing is widening sex gaps over time in terms of overall likelihood to enroll and likelihood to kind of graduate from high school. So when, again, to revisit, we saw that 60% of curriculum enrollees were female in 2015. One way to kind of boost curriculum enrollment is if we were able to bring young men's high school graduation rates, on-time graduation rates, and immediate enrollment rates up to, or enrollment rates up to those of women. That would add an additional 21,000 curriculum enrollments estimated per year to the community college system statewide. It would slightly cannibalize from continuing education, but this is where we're talking about 18 to 24-year-olds as a key target. And overall, the largest impact would be a significant bump in enrollments due to an increasing number of young men enrolled. And last but not least is what we have seen is a rising impact of for-profits. They're definitely attracting a growing share of degree seekers, and it's an almost one-to-one cannibalization of for-profit enrollments, taking away from the community college curriculum enrollments. And while this may be relatively small in number compared to the total landscape of enrollments, the for-profit institutions disproportionately impact women, non-traditional learners who are ages 35 and over, and minorities. And one way that both the community colleges have an opportunity to kind of regain, if community colleges are able to regain just half of the market share that for-profit institutions have captured, that's an additional 8,000 enrollments every year, again, predominantly among adult learners and individuals who may not be as well served by for-profit institutions as they could be by the community college system. But that is kind of our high-level summary. I will put my contact information here, but I don't know how you want to do this, Bill, but I'm happy to take questions now.
I'll open up to everyone else. Y'all have any questions for Dr. Tippett?
Are we able to get a copy of the slides?
Absolutely.
Would you like for us just to email you directly?
How about Bill, do you want to share them with people who attended, or?
So what we'll do is we'll probably to respond to all listeners that went out to, and we can include probably a link to the actual presentation as well as the actual PowerPoint.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question. I don't know if people can hear me.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Has there been any research that you have been engaged in that looks at the change in the workforce, moving towards more contract and part-time gig economy kinds of things, and that might impact students' willingness to invest in college when there's not as many more stable kinds of jobs out there, especially perhaps for men?
I think that's a great question, but I have not conducted that research, and I'm not familiar with research on that. If anybody is, I'd love to hear it. But I know that that's definitely an emerging area that is getting increasing attention by researchers.
Anyone else? All right, I did notice a question earlier from Pamela Federline who asked whether or not the high school intentions was going to be part of the P20 system. And Pamela, I don't have an answer right now. I'd look at their dictionaries, but I think there's a good chance that that would be in there. All right, any more questions? All right,
Thanks so much.
Not hearing anything else. Dr. Tippett, thank you very much. You've been a great partner the last year, and we really enjoyed these presentations, and we look forward to sharing with the wider audience.
Thank you for having me. Thanks, everybody.
All right, y'all take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.